What happens when an institution spends every day looking for danger? And what happens when one of the largest law enforcement organizations in America spends decades training itself to find enemies? That's what I like to explore today. This is not about walls, and this is not about asylum law or immigration policy or deportation quotas. I want to talk about the culture of law enforcement. Because one of the central ideas behind the podcast is that people, as well as institutions, have lenses from which they view reality and consequently from which they act. And once the lens becomes powerful enough, it begins to shape reality itself. Over the weekend, I watched a really interesting documentary on HBO titled Critical Incident, and it examined the death of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. After having been in the United States for more than 20 years as a small businessman, he built swimming pools. In 2010, he was processed and physically deported from San Diego. At the time of the incident, he was handcuffed, and then, while restrained, he was severely beaten and shocked by taser by several patrol agents. This incident was captured on video by bystanders, and it was ruled later a homicide by the county coroner. Yet, no criminal charges were ever filed against the agents involved. Now, I don't bring up this case to relitigate it. This is not political. This is not an issue of politics. As a matter of fact, the incident took place under the Obama administration and quite similar to other incidents we've seen recently by the current administration. I bring it up because it raises a deeper question. How does an enforcement institution see the people it encounters? Are they citizens? Are they human beings? Are they problems? Are they threats? Because the institutional culture influences perception, and perception influences behavior. And this is the question I'd like to explore today. However, before we continue, I want to define two important words: organization and institution. Similar, but not quite the same. An organization is a structured group of people that work together towards a common goal or objective. Corporations, universities, police departments, these are all organizations. An institution is larger. These are the enduring systems and norms and traditions and rules that shape society. So, for example, the law is an institution, religion is an institution, marriage and democracy are institutions. And organizations operate within institutions. And institutions also develop cultures. And cultures create assumptions. And assumptions become the lens from which we view reality and the world and therefore act from. I'm not saying that the lens is wrong, but it is important to consider that it's really never neutral. It's a personal filter. So now let's consider the environment many Border Patrol agents work in. They work in an environment of drug trafficking, human trafficking, smuggling, violence, organized criminal networks, dead bodies in the desert, families in crisis. There is an element of constant uncertainty. And whether you support stronger immigration enforcement or not, it's really difficult to deny that such environments shape the people who regularly operate within it. How could it not? So let me ask a simple question. If the job requires you to constantly search for threats and violations, smugglers and traffickers, what happens to your perception of the world? Is one suddenly more alert, more cautious, or just overly suspicious? Let's stay on the case of Border Patrol agents. It happens to be that most are veterans. Roughly one third are prior military. And that makes sense. The military develops discipline and commitment, resilience, mission focus, and these are all important qualities. But military institutions and civilian society fundamentally have different purposes. The military exists to confront threats, whereas a civilian society exists to balance security with personal liberties. And while these goals may overlap at times, they are not identical. The military is built around very clear distinctions: friend, foe, ally, enemy. And in war, these distinctions are essential and likely life saving. However, democratic societies are more complicated. Citizens are not enemy combatants, journalists are not hostile forces, and protesters are not invading armies. Political opponents are not enemies of the state. In a democratic society, danger emerges when wartime frameworks begin to operate in civilian institutions, not because anyone intends harm deliberately, and not because these people are evil, but because the institutions that they work in shape their perception, and that perception shapes personal behavior. And eventually, the lens from which they see from becomes their reality. Now, to be fair, heightened vigilance is not inherently wrong. Many enforcement agents would argue that vigilance is necessary, and I would agree that they are right. Border agents encounter armed smugglers, traffickers, crime and criminal organization. There is a constant danger, and the public expects them to remain alert. The question is not whether that vigilance is necessary, the question is, how should democratic societies maintain accountability? The balance is where healthy institutions and democracies can both live. Now, let's return to the story of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. Because the most disturbing part of this story wasn't necessarily the violence itself, although it was quite brutal and very similar to other videos online of police brutality. What makes the case significant is what happened afterward. According to reporting, it came to light in 2024 that specialized Border Patrol units called SIT for Critical Incident Teams would arrive at the scene of extreme violence events by CVP and immigrants and regularly destroyed evidence to protect the institution and agents from accountability. This included obtaining cell phone footage shot by observers and destroying anything that made the agents appear culpable of police brutality. These teams were run off the books and without any congressional authorization, and they existed for years. So, when an enforcement organization becomes so large and powerful and is extremely well funded and insulated, does its primary mission still remain as an enforcement mission? Or does part of the mission now become to protect itself? Now, institutions will rarely expand in a straight line. They first expand to protect, and then they need to protect their own agency, and then they also need to protect their own reputation, and consequently, then their own authority. Eventually, protecting the institution can become as important as the original mission itself, and this is not just unique to Border Patrol. Institutions face the temptation to prioritize self preservation. So, my question is whether accountability grows at the same pace as power, or does it simply just become deleted? Recently, Congress approved roughly $70 billion dollars for additional immigration enforcement. Think about that. This is actually the amount equal to the budget, the annual budget of the US Marines, an entire military branch. These resources have been directed towards ICE and CVP and are now approaching the budget of the United States Marine Corps. Pause for a moment and think about that. An institution whose mission is domestic enforcement now operates with the resources comparable to a branch of the US military. Regardless of your politics, that's quite remarkable, and it raises another important question. What happens when a domestic enforcement institution begins operating at a military scale? Now, in political science, there is a phenomenon called mission creep. It's when an institution's mission looks very different from the original mission. It's not that organizations wake up one morning and decide to exceed their original purpose. These changes and expansions happen gradually with a new authority. perhaps the introduction of a new technology. Perhaps there's an emergence of a new emergency, which creates a new exception and creates as well a new funding stream. And at every point, each step might sound reasonable. Each step may sound temporary. But eventually, the mission that is being acted out is very different from the original one that was authorized. And history is actually full of these examples where enforcement actions infringed on the personal liberties of American citizens. Take Pearl Harbor, for example. Fear contributed and legalized the detention of Japanese Americans, American citizens. And during the Cold War, government surveillance expanded beyond national security concerns and into monitoring of civil rights activists, labor and union organizers, and anti war movements. More recently, after September 11th, Americans accepted sweeping new surveillance powers for the government through the Patriot Act. Now, most people accepted these changes because they believed they were necessary and protection, safety, and security were the goal. But history teaches us also an important lesson. Government power rarely calls itself out as power. It introduces it as protection instead, as safety, and as something needed. Because the reasoning often sounds very reasonable. And so people stop to ask when and where that expansion will end. Which then brings us to what I call the enemy construct. This happens when enforcement institutions and organizations exist beyond stopping crime, or terrorism, or trafficking, or unauthorized entry. These are all very legitimate missions, but over time, something else happens. The threat becomes so central to the institution's identity that everything is perceived as a threat. And your identity depends on finding threats. And so you become very good at finding them, sometimes even where they don't exist, or at least not to the degree that is perceived. And the problem emerges when the lens expands beyond its original purpose. But this is not unique to immigration enforcement. We see it everywhere today. Journalists are being deemed and called enemies by our president. The president has also declared that universities are enemies, immigrants are enemies, and even people with different political views are enemies. When citizens exercising their constitutional rights become enemies, the target now has changed. It's amplified, and the enemy construct expands. Once institutions begin seeing enemies everywhere, eventually almost everyone starts to look like one. And this is where I think the most important question emerges. What happens when a culture of enforcement and a culture of fear begin to reinforce each other? Fear justifies greater powers, expansion uncovers more threats generate more fear, and more fear justifies more expansion. And so now we're in a feedback loop that becomes self sustaining. But what is important is that democratic societies must remain vigilant, not merely against real threats, but against the tendency for institutions and organizations to grow beyond their original purpose. The question is not whether immigration enforcement is necessary. The question is not whether borders matter. Every nation has borders and every nation enforces laws. The question is whether we're paying as much attention to the accountability of these organizations and institutions as we are at security. Because accountability is what separates a democratic institution from unchecked power. Every institution develops a lens, every profession develops a lens, political movements have a lens, every citizen develops a lens. The danger is not having one, the danger is forgetting that you're looking through it.